Good evening, everybody. I'm Susan Keeney, and on behalf of our Dennison Place, NECKO, and Circles neighborhoods, welcome to tonight's presentations. Tonight's presentation, From Urban to Suburban, the Dennison-McMillen Historic District. We actually had this presentation live and in person in 2020, if you can believe it, before the COVID shutdown. Our presenter, Rory Krupp, did such a good job that we asked him to do it again, this time through the convenience and safety of Zoom. Rory, principal at Owen and Eastlake, received his Master of Arts degree in American History with a certificate in Historic Preservation from the University of Cincinnati. He received the Carol S. Nagel Award from the Cincinnati Preservation Association, as well as a fellowship from the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, Kentucky. Rory did extensive research on the history and architecture of our three neighborhoods, which culminated in the nomination of these neighborhoods to become Columbus's next local historic district. The presentation of this work is important. And signals that we're still active and more committed than ever to completing the historic district process. At any time during the presentation, you can ask questions in the chat box that's below, and we'll try to answer them after the presentation. And also in the chat box will be contact information if you have further questions or want to know how you can become involved. We know that you are in for a treat tonight and hope that you will see the significance of one of Columbus's oldest suburbs, Dennison Place, NECKO, and the Circles. And now, Rory, we turn it over to you.
Thanks, Susan. I was the consultant who did the survey and the history of the neighborhood in 2017 and 16, I think. It's been a while. And so we're all familiar with the neighborhood, I guess. Here we have a nice map of the Dennison Place addition, which is the first part of the neighborhood that was platted out in the 1870s, around 1875, when the streetcar came up High Street. The map is from the 1890s, so it's fairly filled in by this point. You can see the first streets that were done were probably Clark Place and Smith Place. They would have the oldest houses in the neighborhood that were still there. You can see it's filled in with the school down at the bottom. There are retail establishments filled in along High Street and a good number of churches. One thing to point out is, as far as the names go, some of the names are like from early landholders, and in the best developer tradition, some other names are from family members, such as Herman Street is probably from Herman Dennison. Dennison Park addition came later. It was planted in like 1888 and started to fill in the 1890s. You can see in the map here, it's not totally developed yet. The problem was, and we will see this in an example of a number of houses, is one of the major developers in the addition needed a loan to complete some projects after the financial panic of 1893 and 1896, and bought some fraudulent mortgage documents from a woman in Lancaster for $8,000 or $9,000 to complete his projects. It did not work. This is something that today would probably be prevented by mortgage, like title insurance and that type of thing. In 1890s, it was still pretty wide open real estate wise. Yeah. So we got away with it for a while. Until he was caught and convicted and went to prison for 18 months. The problem was, since there was a depression in the late 1890s. Since there was a depression in the 1890s, they couldn't unload the lots. They went to court, through the court system and things like that. So this is why there are parts of it that are not developed at this point, because it's clogged up in the court system. And then the last our neighborhoods is the McMillen Homestead, which is platted pretty early at the same time, but wasn't developed until later, the teens and 20s. There are some houses closer to Neal, but overall it was a latecomer. Okay, so we have the Neal family, or the Dennisons, one of our namesakes of our historic district. Mr. Dennison was a governor at the beginning of the Civil War and later a postmaster. His wife, Erasmus Dennison, who was in the naval midshipman uniform, and his daughters, and an unidentified man in the thing. They're in Columbus here. They are not on a ship. It's a backdrop. Erasmus wanted to be in the Navy in the worst way, but wasn't really cut out for military service. But since his husband or father was a governor, they kind of shoehorned him in, and it ended in disaster. He committed suicide around 1870 in a brothel in San Francisco.
There you go.
Lizzie, the daughter on the right, too, would have a husband with later problems. Elizabeth McMillen, who would be Dennison, married Thomas Worthington King, who died in 1850, shortly after they were married, when they had 3 children. He had an undisclosed disease and died in about 3 weeks after he got it in Cincinnati, where they lived. This normally would have put your life in turmoil, but since they were fairly wealthy, she decamped to Europe with her mother-in-law. Sarah Worthington King Peter, as you notice, only has like good Ohio royalty names, except for Peter, which was a British consul. So Elizabeth McMillen spent most of the 1850s in Europe, going between Rome and Canterbury, where she educated her children. She went twice. Whenever something went wrong, she went to Canterbury. So she was in Columbus very little. She spent most of her time in Cincinnati. McMillen comes from Elizabeth or William Lynn McMillen, her second husband, who she married around 1861. He was a surgeon, educated in Ohio, and when he graduated, served in the Crimean War in the Russian army, which apparently was a popular occupation for young surgeons because it paid well. Surgeons from the eastern United States usually worked for England, but the War of 1812, like anti-British sentiment, was pretty strong in the Midwest, even in the 1860s. So surgeons would not work for the English. They would work for the Russians instead. So he spent most of the Crimean War being a surgeon there. It was difficult only in the fact that you would probably catch something and die, as about half of them did. Typhoid and things like that were the biggest threat, not the English. It was actually disease. And there are quite a few diaries by surgeons from this period that are interesting. He unfortunately did not do one, which is not that surprising. He was, somewhat reprehensible, as we'll see here. But after his service in the Crimea, he came back and became a doctor in Ohio. And at the beginning of the Civil War, became a surgeon in a regimental unit. Around this time, he met Elizabeth Dennison, and they quickly married. During the Civil War, he was initially a surgeon, but became commanding officer in a regiment. The same one where the Kelton House, which is haunted, as by legend, that the young Kelton boy served in. It was under his command that he was killed when McMillen was drunk, which he seems to have spent most of the Civil War heavily in the bag. He was almost court-martialed a couple of times, but Sherman had a soft spot for him and bailed him out of trouble at the end. Probably any other officer would have been run out on a rail. He had a penchant for falling out of boxcars when he was drunk, falling off of his horse. He abused prisoners of war. One can blame it on the war, but he was fairly reprehensible after the war too. After the war, the McMillens moved to Louisiana, where he was a planter, and became associated with the Crescent League in New Orleans, where they went against Reconstructionists. So he did that until he was appointed the customs collector of New Orleans, which was a historically job of 2 for me and 1 for the government type of thing. Lived in a hotel where Charles Dickens stayed, loved it, and lived pretty large through the 1870s and 80s with this job. Now, we're not really sure where, I'm not sure, and it's kind of sketchy where Elizabeth lived at. It seems she may have lived in Martha's Vineyard for a while and in New England and in Cincinnati. It doesn't seem like they were together a lot. He had a plantation outside of Baton Rouge, and it Doesn't seem like she was there a lot. And he wasn't either. He lived in New Orleans. So it was like unsure how much time they actually spent together. James Forsythe is another like character who married Lizzie Dennison, one of the daughters. He's the second on the left. These are all Sheridan's command. From the list, we have Sheridan, John Forsythe, Merritt, Devon, and on the far right is Custer. After the Civil War, and was sent out west, along with the rest of this bunch who all had frontier positions. Forsythe is most famous for being the commander of the 7th Cavalry at Wounded Knee. So after Wounded Knee, the street sign got an E, and maps and things like that. I don't know if it was a disassociation from Forsythe at the time, or somebody in the map making department just added an E to it. So, but anyway, Forsythe Street in the neighborhood is named after him, or Lizzie to be charitable. So since the McMillens and the Dennisons didn't have a whole lot to do with property development because they were in Louisiana, the Dennisons traveled extensively and were in California a lot of the time. And so they turned their their portfolio over to their attorney, James Lauren, who lived on the corner of High and King in the greenhouse that we see here that I think everybody probably recognizes. Lauren was the one who actually laid everything out. He made the circles, he designed that. North Broadway was supposed to have circles that he platted but never put in the action. So he was the one that actually laid out the neighborhood and sold everything and was a pretty major property developer. One thing he really had going for him is when he was doing the circles in the other neighborhoods in the early 1890s, he was also the director of public works for the city. And so it was not a problem to get a sewer put into any of his developments or anything like that, since he was in charge of that and developing these things at the same time. It's kind of an early example of the Columbus way.
That's okay.
All right, so let's just look at houses. So if your house is in here, it just got picked because it was a house. So we'll point this out right away, as we always do. So I believe this has been a while, but I think this is on Clark or Smith. And it has quite a collection of Italianate houses. We're going to come back to the porch here in a little while, which is interesting because it is not original. Here we have a sweatshop from my bicycle of Italianate houses in the Clark and Smith area. But you can tell they've got the overhang. It kind of looks like over the Rhine. Narrow porches, hipped roofs, and hoods over the windows. These, you don't see these in much of the other neighborhood because it's so early. It's getting late for Italianates. These are probably from the 1880s in this area, whereas the rest of the neighborhood would be from the 1890s. The clear story windows in the top are a good Italianate feature. We thought this porch was probably original because we looked at it for a long time and it has a lot of paint on it. And this is how we date things in like American things, because it hasn't been painted 50 times. And it looks like yes. Plus the lumber is not dimensional. So we thought this is like a good original porch. Another Italianate in the area from about that same time period. It also has like early fence too, which is nice. Queen Anne's were the big one in most of the neighborhood, the most predominant style, except for American four squares. And they're just asymmetrical. The tower gives it away a lot of times, and they were wildly popular. This one's nice because it's actually wood, which are not wildly popular. They're usually brick, a lot of times in the area. These were so common after a while that people became disdainful of them at the time. And along with the fact that any developer would call everything a Queen Anne so that they could sell it. However, this is a good example of an actual Queen Anne. This is too. So in the area, and with little Richardsonian arch in the middle. So it's got a lot of elements in it. It's almost eclectically styled because it has so many things going on at once. some like East-like things at the top, the porch, which is new again, and the rest of the house, although the porch is probably from the 20s. One of the things you see a lot in the neighborhood are these brownstone fronts. And this is an Allen 80 invention or trademark brand type of thing that he did. He was the developer that had the fraud problem. And he developed, as you can see, like noticing this type of style of house, quite a few houses in the neighborhood and throughout Victorian Village too. The Cincinnati Enquirer said he was one of the major developers in Columbus at the time. And his trademark was this. And once you see one, they pop up all over. He was from Columbus. Was probably in his mid 30s, early 30s when he went to prison. Went for 18 months, said the Ohio Penitentiary in the 1890s was not a big deal. Seemed to have enjoyed himself according to newspaper accounts, got out, and went back into real estate development until he died. He lived on Hubbard. So it really didn't set him back except for 2 years. There aren't a lot of Richardsonian Romanesque houses, but there are some, and this is a good example of one. So this is dated already because I think the porch is done if you go past it. So completed. Second Empire ones are like kind of like hen's teeth. There are like 2 or 3 in the neighborhood. So this is a nice one. And it starts to become a little late for this in the 1890s. There were 2 of these, as we know, in the neighborhood, little like 1-story ones. And these are 2 like story and a half. These are super rare. You hardly ever see them. Shingle style house. I believe in Dennison Place Edition. There are a lot of just vernacular houses which do not have styles. This one has kind of a craftsman porch on it. It's probably from the 20s again. These are more common towards High Street. And there was more of a blue collar element closer to High that you went. So we noticed when we went through the census things and records and stuff like that, a lot of tradespeople and minor white collar people lived in that area. It's another colonial revival, kind of vernacular, but then it has the brand new addition on the side. This house is once again a Richardsonian Romanesque one, but we thought it was nice because of its face brick. It's a special kind of hardened brick, and it's at the time quite expensive. So that a lot of times you'll see it, they'll just have the face of the house, the front facade, will be done in the face brick, and the rest will be done in just common brick. This one, somebody spent some serious money and did the whole thing in it. One thing that we started to see during the survey, and this was probably started in the teens, were apartment buildings in place of single family homes. And there were a couple reasons for this. One was that by 1920, if you had your house from like 1870 or 1880, it was functionally and stylistically obsolete by that point. Your like mechanical systems were probably worn out or like not able to keep up with contemporary standards of 1920. And there were more people moving into the neighborhood. So if there was a spot to build, by the 20s, it was usually an apartment building. This one is nice too, because it too has the face brick, the mixed face brick mixed in. The American four squares are probably the second biggest style in the neighborhood. And these are a quintessential American design. They're based on Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie houses. They're designed to fit on an urban lot with as much room inside. There's no wasted space. And still leave green space in the back or room for a garage or things like that. They have elements like they will use the earlier face brick, the prairie style thing you can see up in the dormer, and some classical elements like the large columns, or fluted square columns. Four squares are really common in Dennison Park, Dennison Place Edition. One nice thing was garages. The whole area has an excellent collection of garages. So this is a quintessential design right here because it's a rusticated block, which is handmade. At the time, you would have a block machine and make it. But cars, early cars, were not always mechanically sound and have a propensity to catch on fire or explode. So consequently, people did not want the car next to their house. And there were two routes you could go. You could make it kind of bomb-proof and make a heavy-duty concrete garage like this, or you can make it out of as cheap as wood as you can, so if it blew up, you weren't out anything. So this is at the other end of the spectrum. So this is like from the 20s, you can tell from the hipped roof. And it's fairly bomb-proof, probably except for the new block on the side. Here's a wood version from the 20s. A more disposable, but not really garage. So, you know, if it burned down, it wasn't that big of a thing. By this time in the 20s, cars were a little better. It wasn't like 1910 where your car probably would explode or catch on fire, like, you know, at some time. So by the time we get to the 20s, their new style gets involved, and it's colonial revival houses. So these are common in NECKO in quite a few places. It seems to be the prominent style when we were up there looking at things. So the Tudor revival is another like 1920s style that we see a lot of during here, or in the NECKO area and throughout, if there's infill. So the early apartments replaced Victorian houses, one, because there was a little more light, they were easy to build, and they had sanitary kitchens and appliances. So they would have a built-in kitchen rather than like a piecemeal Hoosier type of thing like that. They would be all white. It was supposed to be lend an air of sanitary, germ-free things rather than like your coal-fired Victorian house. Okay, so if you live in the circles or anywhere over there, you wonder like how early were students in my neighborhood? And we found ads for student boarding houses on King Avenue across from the circles from the 1890s. And it appears that some houses on King Avenue were built as boarding houses for students. So early on in the 1890s, 19 teens, it wasn't so bad up until the war. After the 20s, things broke loose. And there were more students in the neighborhood, and they were able to buy cars. Not good cars, but just cars that an engineer or somebody mechanically sound in your frat house could put together and they could drive around, which turned out to be a problem in the Dennison neighborhoods too, because they didn't have mufflers, horns, brakes, or lights. And so you would get more students than this driving around on game day, going through yards, tearing things up. And then if they parked, they would have a petting party, which is like just a euphemism for like sex party, and park in your yard. And so there are numerous accounts of people in the circles like, oh my God, like what happened to my neighborhood? And is this ever going to end? So it's been an issue for a long time. Ever since the cars were around, there was been a parking problem. By 1914, there were articles about cars jamming alleys and streets, yards. The problem was at the time there were no parking rules. So one can imagine that if you could just park your car, you could just leave it essentially anywhere. People parked on the oval. Parallel parking was pretty much unknown. They had to make laws that said like each of your wheels had to be so far from a curb because it was just willy-nilly. After the war, along with the students, there was one student market, but there's also like a serious housing shortage after the war. So there was a moratorium on permits, and there was a building supply shortage, hence a housing shortage at the same time. So from like 1919, like 21 or so was a rental boom of just epic proportions. Well, developers built spec rental houses as fast as they could, or apartment buildings, and sold them. And it was supposed to be a great investment. Like the newspapers are lined with like, you can get 89%, yearly return if you buy or invest in one of these. And people did, and would flip them at the same time. We saw instances where it'd be sold like 3 or 4 times in a year, and double their money each time. The market was just out of control, even compared to today. If you look really closely at some things, you can see there's like weird choices of building materials in the early 20s. You look at the bottom of the basement, those are like paving bricks to use for the foundation. So sometimes the houses are framed almost out of anything, and there's like non-traditional use of building materials during this period because there was a shortage. Terrace apartments became really popular during this period. This is a fancy one. They have the crenellated, like the cornice and thing like that. And they are still popular today because they're fairly light. The bedrooms are upstairs, the kitchen's downstairs. It's a simple layout. They were cheap to build, and they were wildly popular. Much more so than like the kind of like serpentine route through a Victorian house. So there are a lot of those in the neighborhood from like the 20s, like rental market and speculative like investment. Columbus is also one of the places. These are not all over Ohio. There are certain places that have them, and they require a somewhat large and flat lot. Therefore, they're almost non-existent in Cincinnati. Columbus has a lot. Cleveland has some. Akron has quite a few. So it's kind of a regional thing, depending on essentially topography. The other thing that happened in the 20s was, since your house was functionally obsolete and you didn't want to live there anymore, you would move to Bexley or Upper Arlington or Clintonville, to another suburb. And to cash in on the student market, you could alter your house into a large rental. And this is what we have right here. You can see, if you take off all the porches in the side addition, it's just a simple gabled L house from the 1880s or early 90s. And then in the 20s, somebody put on all these prairie style elements, the porches with the giant overhangs and the addition with the overhangs and things like that. It's nice because it's fairly, it has good architectural elements for what it is, for additions, but they don't match the original house at all. So we thought this was a great example of like house alteration from single family home to an apartment building that you probably wouldn't recognize today. Some are more recognizable.
Are you saying like houses built 1890s, 1900s, whatever, and then because of the student influx in the 1920s, people were moving out of this neighborhood and then converting their house to rentals because of the student influx in the 1920s?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. By the 1920s, the neighborhood was in a decline. It had like its heyday was over. As far, at that point, people were like, we got to get out. So, and they were like more stylish and more comfortable homes to live in. So they moved. And instead the rental market took over. Yeah, it's early, like in the 1920s. Here's another one. You see a not so sympathetic brick addition. But there are other ones in the back. You can tell like the little green addition on the right side in the back is also from the 20s. And so around the neighborhood, especially in the western part of Dennison Place, there is quite a bit of this. Not so much in the circles, because the houses were kind of shoehorned on there. There wasn't a lot of room for expansion. But the lots seemed to be a little bigger and a little more amenable to additions in Dennison Place. You can tell this is from the 20s from this concrete block in the foundation. So it's a cast block versus like the stone on there. So this was probably subdivided in the 20s, we thought. The other thing we noticed in that is that a lot of houses don't have their original porches on. They might like usually the roof is the same shape, but the pillars and the foundation and the railings in this case are all from the 20s. This house is from the 1880s. So you have to figure after 40 years, your wooden porch is going to probably gone or rotten. And so they were replaced with these cast block, which on Clark and Smith, the cast block salesman had a heyday because they are everywhere on that street. There are quite a few. There are very few original porches from the 19th century, but there are a lot from the early 19th century. And so once again, this will kind of jump out at you as you look around, but the porch is significant in its own right, but it's from the 20s. Here's a good example of like the block salesman really did his job. So it's another instance of cast block in a vaguely craftsman style. The other thing you see in the 20s all over is people split their lots and would put on rear houses, and for sale or for rent. It seems to be a split in that, a little of both. This one's on like 7th, I think, between 5th. So, and the house is from around 1920. But every piece of available land, like in all three neighborhoods, started to be built on fairly intensively by the 20s. Rear apartments. This is an apartment, I think, Forsyth. But yeah, there are rear ones too, built around in the 20s. So it's a terrace apartment behind someone's terrace apartment. Permastone was invented in Columbus in 1928, something we can all be proud of. So this house is entirely clad on King in Permastone.
I don't know how to turn your speaker on.
It was built by a Civil War veteran or occupied who was a clerk downtown. A strange story. He had one arm, and at his funeral, he invited, or his pallbearers were the guys who held him down when they amputated his arm during the Civil War. So you don't get that every day.
That's actually on 5th. These are on 5th.
Yeah, it's on 5th. Okay, so this is the sister house. They're the same house, we figured out. So one just has Permastone. So you can see the alterations. This was a church at one time. Then I believe in Oddfellows. And there was another story tacked on at the top of it. The bottom is fairly intact except for the windows and stuff. The rest of it is not. So these are like a later alteration in the 50s. And you can kind of see the line of like the first floor. We liked this house when we surveyed because it's got this addition on it, which we could never really figure out how old it was because the door surrounding it is from the 20s. So this was a favorite. Whoever did it did an excellent job. And the trim in the windows and stuff is just exquisite. So it was a great addition, but just somewhat baffling to the architectural historian. You can see in the middle here, there's some 60s infill where people decided to join houses together. This, thankfully, was a short-lived thing. I believe there was a code change that you could not do that after a while. But there are a couple, I think this is on Neil. There was one on 6th or 7th. Yeah. There's a house in the middle of this that was owned by a mining owner in the 1890s. And if you go to the rear, you can still see the house. It ruins the streetscape. You know, the streetscape is punctuated by the gaps in between houses and stuff like that. So there's a little rhythm and it takes that away. So if you're going to be like pedantically historic, like as I'm being, I think that's why I would be against it. Then there's 70s infill, which in this case, they took 2 lots and combined them. And this has since been, the zoning code has changed and you can no longer do this too. This house is significant because it exploded in 2005 or so in an early marijuana vaping experiment.
Oh, if there's any particular.
Yeah, which blew it off its foundation. So it has since been put back. But it's an early, as far as history goes, it's and there are some contemporary designs in here too. So once again, this one's on 2 lots instead of 1, but it is a later, like mid-70s design. That this is rare. We only saw just one of these like this. Battelle moved houses around in the 1970s. And when we did our survey, after a while, we decided we could pick up Battelle houses pretty fast, the ones that they had owned. And the ones they had moved, we could tell because it's a 4-square house from like 1910 on a concrete block foundation. So we're like, that's like first clue number 1, like where did this house come from? And it probably came from Perry Avenue is what we thought. Battelle also got in trouble in the 70s for sandblasting their houses. American Council for Historic Preservation reprimanded them. Sandblasting your house is now not thought to be good. And houses like this, when the brick is pretty late, it's so hard, it probably doesn't make a difference. If you live in German Village and the brick is really soft, in the 1850s, you may have destroyed your house. But in this case, it's probably not a big deal. The other giveaway is they have these little thin Tuscan columns on the porches, seem to be a Battelle thing. And if you see a house with those, chances are great that Battelle owned it. And it was part of their renovation program when they were forced to divest their houses in the 70s and 80s. They owned quite a few houses in the neighborhood during that point in case they wanted to expand and were forced by a court order to get rid of them, since real estate was not part of their original charter. So they gutted them and sold them so that the next person could fix it in a somewhat economical manner. It was a little controversial because they pushed the people out that lived in it. On the other hand, their thought was the people who lived in them lived in cut up apartments, and these were single family homes, and they wanted to return it to single family occupancy. It's what Battelle wanted to do, and they did. Moving houses is actually really easy, except for utility lines. You know, if you do it slow and don't shake things, you're in good shape. But it's over like above ground utilities that kill it for everything. Otherwise, in the 1840s and 50s, people moved houses just as a matter of course. You know, it was not a big deal. So now you just can't move them far because it costs so much to take the wires down. Okay, so the other thing with Battelle moved was actually moved even more houses in Dennison Park Place. And these houses, I believe, were on Perry and were slated for demolition. They made a little cul-de-sac development, which is very 1970s in its layout. Oh, go to the famous resident area section. So there are a couple of people we thought were notable in the neighborhood. I'm sure there are many more. But this guy was a cancer researcher and was famous and invented a couple techniques which are still used today, even urology. And this is his house on Belmont. Ammon Hennessy was a Catholic workers person in the 20s and 30s. He went to prison during World War I for draft evasion, and later started a Catholic workers' house in Utah, in between protesting income taxes and nuclear bombs. We recommended the new development be named the Hennessy on King, but that didn't come to anything. We're on Fifth. I take that back. And this is where he lived on him. This is where his parents lived and where he went to resisted the draft and went to jail. Roy Lichtenstein lived in the neighborhood. And I think this is actually in the house. So like narrowing the date on the photo down to when he was here, this is right before he was denied tenure by the art department at Ohio State and moved to Cleveland. And this is his house where he lived at. The last place he lived in Columbus. And Edgar Weiland, city council person and Weiland Park person, lived on West 6th. He was a progressive reformer in Columbus.
You mentioned in the discussion about Battelle and the fight of Ohio State and all, thinking that our neighborhoods were not significant. I think we're fighting the same thing again, and this is the significance of studying our neighborhood and working very hard to become a local historic district, because I think the kinds of pressures that were back 100 years ago, we are still feeling today. Rory, I'd just like to thank you so much for this talk. I think it was really fun.